Hey everyone, welcome back. Last video, we kind of started what's called the Cold War, this era of just rising tension and dislike between the United States and the Soviet Union that never is really a real war between each other, but has a lot of little wars and all these hot spots in the Cold War. And then hopefully you learned a little bit about the Berlin airlift already if you're following along in class. And today we're going to learn about a few things, but the main focus is going to be on what's called the Korean War. So, just to give you a kind of overview of some of the major things that happened in the Cold War, because remember, the Cold War is a really long time. We're looking at 1945 to like 1990 or so like 45 years of time, which is a really long time. Um, so we learned a little bit about the Marshall Plan, which was the United States giving a lot of money to Western European countries to try to keep them from turning communist. Learned a little bit about the Berlin blockade and airlift, where the Soviet Union blocked the United States from getting to Berlin. And the United States basically said, you know what, you could block us from getting there by land, so we'll just fly our way in, shoot our planes out of the sky, and you just declared war on us. And eventually the Soviet Union, they don't shoot our planes down, and eventually they open back up Berlin. Today we're going to learn about the Korean War, the first real conflict of the Cold War. Uh, Later you'll learn about McCarthyism or the Red Scare. This is just kind of a preview. Something called the Berlin Wall. You've probably heard of that already. The space race, which is pretty cool. The nuclear arms race, who can get the most nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which is probably the scariest single moment of the Cold War. And the Vietnam War, one of the most famous things of the Cold War. So, just to set this up a little bit, because remember, our focus today is going to be on the Korean War. After World War II, a new organization was made called the United Nations. Sometimes today it's just called the UN. And this is a new international, meaning across the world, organization that's designed to prevent future wars. Remember, after World War One, because we called World War One the war to end all wars, we created something called the League of Nations. Well, the League of Nations didn't work, and we know it didn't work because its goal was to prevent wars, and we had World War II. Therefore, the League of Nations was a failure. Well, the United Nations is set up after World War II to take to kind of take the place of the League of Nations because that failed. And the United Nations is a little bit stronger than the League of Nations. And for the most part, it worked. Yeah, there's been a lot of wars since World War II, but we haven't had a World War III. So therefore, the United Nations has mostly been a success. And the idea is you get leaders from all over the world. This is real pictures from the United Nations to come together and discuss problems. The idea is if you discuss your problems before fighting, you can hopefully prevent fights. And it has the power to enforce laws. It has actually two major ways that it enforces what its laws are. One, it gives what are called economic sanctions, which is a real fancy way of saying we fine, meaning if a country does something bad, they have to pay money, or we boycott them, where we don't trade with them. And a lot of countries are really hurt when other countries won't trade with them. Or the United Nations has its own military, and it will go in and actually fight if a country is doing something wrong. So that's pretty important. And also, after World War II, two major alliances. Remember, an alliance is where different countries come and form together and agree basically, I got your back if you got my back. And one of them, you may have heard of it before, is called NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And you may have heard of it because the United States is part of it. So in 1949, the United States, Canada, and Western European countries form a military alliance called NATO. And they promise to help each other out in times of war. And this is actually going to come into play in the Korean War, both NATO and the United Nations. Well, shortly thereafter, and this is really after the Korean War, though, what's called the Warsaw Pact is formed. And this is the NATO symbol. And this is the symbol for the Warsaw Pact. Well, the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union and their friends. And they form in 1955. So the Soviet Union and a bunch of Eastern European countries form an opposing military alliance. Opposing meaning like it's against NATO. So basically, if you want to simplify it, NATO is like the United States and its friends team, and the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union and their friends and their team, and we're really kind of against each other. And the reason we get ourselves into all of these issues during the Cold War, is this idea. Remember, we talked about Truman had this idea called the Truman Doctrine, where we would stop the spread of communism. And the reason we believe this is because we believe that there is something known as the domino effect. It sounds complicated, but it's really simple. The USA was worried that the United States' influence over all these other countries was making them more powerful, and it was going to make communism more powerful, and it was going to spread. And just a side note, if you didn't notice, the United States of America is usually simplified as USA, abbreviated. Well, the Soviet Union a lot of times is abbreviated as USSR. And I know that isn't the initials for Soviet Union. It's because its real name is the United Soviet Socialist Republic. So United Soviet Socialist Republic, well, that's USSR. So the United States doesn't want communism to spread any further. And the idea is, if you ever have seen dominoes stacked up beside each other, you stack 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you knock the first one over and it knocks the next one, which knocks the next one, which knocks the next one. And that's what we're worried. We're like, if this country here becomes communist, the one beside it might, and the one beside it might, and the one beside it might. And then next thing you know, we're surrounded by a bunch of communist countries. And that is why the United States is going to fight so hard to stop it from spreading. We don't want to give one more inch to communism because we're worried it's going to keep spreading. And that's why we get all these hot spots. So it's a Cold War with these hot spots where it gets rising tension. It's like we're getting a close fight in the Soviet Union, getting closer, getting closer, getting closer. And luckily, each time we stop before the United States and Soviet Union really fight. Because if we would have fought, as you'll kind of see as we learn about the space race and especially the nuclear arms race, it would have been really bad because we both end up with atomic bombs, which would have caused a lot of destruction. So these are times where we almost go to war against each other. And you saw some of them in our major events. But for the most important hotspots are the Korean War, which we're about to learn about, the space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War. Let's look at the, remember, and this is the key to understanding the entire Cold War, is the Soviet Union wants to spread communism around the world. The Soviet Union wants to spread communism, and the United States, let me simplify this for you, if I can. The Soviet Union wants to spread communism, and the United States wants to stop the spread of communism, but we want to spread capitalism, remember, our system. So it's interesting if you look at these two little cartoons that were drawn. So in this one, this is how the United States sees it. See, this is little Uncle Sam right here. We see big bad Russia, which is symbolized by a bear, kind of spreading out across the world. But it's interesting because if you look at this cartoon, this is how the Soviet Union sees it. See, they're this cute little teddy bear, and they see big mean Uncle Sam trying to spread its capitalism around the world. Remember, we're very different, and we just can't see eye to eye. And one of the first really scary times is the Korean War, which is our focus today. It starts in 1950 when communist North Korea invades democratic capitalist South Korea. And the United States joins because we want to stop the spread of communism. Remember this idea of containing it. We're like building a fence, like it cannot spread any further. And the war is going to go back and forth until a ceasefire, which is an agreement to stop fighting. Cease means stop, like stop firing at each other, is signed in 1953. And the North Korea and South Korea remain today, like 60 some years later, divided at the same place, what's called the 38th parallel. And I'll show you that here in a minute, which is odd because this is exactly the same spot it was before the war. So this is the country of Korea. And you'll notice it's right beside China and Japan's right here. This line right here basically symbolizes the 38th parallel. And I'll show you what that kind of means later. But so the North Korea is going to invade South Korea here. And when North Korea invades South Korea, they push them all the way back. See this little line right here? And they basically kick the butts of the South Koreans for the first start of the war. The United States, with help from the United Nations, is going to join on September 15th. And we land right here, and our troops just start kicking the butts of the North Korean troops, and we actually push them all the way up the map until you get to the very top right here. So we had them up against the wall here. The problem is we get so close to China that China gets mad, and China joins the war on the North Korean side. And they send millions of troops down, and they push us back all the way to here again, where we kind of dig in and build trenches and fortify it. And for 3 more years, we don't move at all. They're still fighting, but nobody's able to push back against the other one until we finally agree to stop fighting in 1953. And if you look, this is a better map of Korea. This is basically what the 38th parallel is. And if you've ever seen, and yeah, remember they both remain divided today at the same spot. So to understand what the idea of a 38th parallel is, if this is a map of the world, remember we have this imaginary grid of the world, like a graphing paper on like you do in math, where we have the equator is 0, and every line up or down from it gets a number until you get all the way up to 90 here. So if you go up and find the 30 here, and here's 45, 38 is about right here, and here's Korea if you look closely where I'm pointing. And that's where it gets divided. Just so you know, if South Carolina is right here, Sumter is about 33, 34 degrees north is what it's called, because this up direction is north. So Korea is divided right at 38 degrees north. And today, they're still divided. Like you see this little concrete block right here? This is the division between South Korea is up here, and North Korea is right here. And there's literally soldiers standing there right now waiting for the other one. See, these South Korean soldiers are guarding, and these North Korean soldiers are guarding. And these people in the back are actually tourists. They go there to get their picture taken at the border. And that's cutes and funsy and all, but it's actually pretty serious business. There's a lot of tension still between North Korea and South Korea. And every once in a while, they almost come close to fighting again. And luckily, every time it kind of dies down and they don't fight. And North Korea today is still communist, and they're controlled by a dictator named Kim Jong-un, which is this guy right here. And he's basically almost like worshipped in his country. The people think that he's like the greatest thing ever. And it's kind of a weird thing because we don't think like that in America. But he's the dictator, and he's has complete power like Hitler did in Germany. And the people listen to him, and he could do whatever he wants because he's in charge. And the military supports him. So that's how the Korean War goes. You're going to, if you're following along in class, you're going to read a little bit on the Duxter's article, and we got a little assignment for you. And then I think tomorrow, if you're following in class, you're going to learn about what McCarthyism is, also known as the Red Scare, which is pretty cool. Well, cool to learn about, would not be cool to live through. It was a pretty bad thing. And we'll learn a little bit more about some of these Cold War things next week.